If you are like most beginners, I'm sure you're wondering, how should I open up a chess game? Well, in today's video, I'm going to explain just that. Stay tuned. Let's talk about the opening. The opening consists of the first 10 to 15 moves of the game. Within the opening phase of the game, you have goals that as a beginner you should focus on. Goals, GOALS. I created a little acronym here for you guys to help you remember the purpose when it comes to starting a game. So the G stands for grab the center. O stands for obtain active squares for minor pieces. A stands for achieve king safety. AO stands for lastly develop your queen. And S stands for secure the back rank with connected rooks. Why is the opening and the ideas of the opening important? Let's talk about that. Objective 1, grab the center. The center consists of these 4 squares right here, D4, D5, E4, and E5. Where most of the action happens in the center of the board actually consists of this bigger square right here. C3, 4, 5, and 6, D3, 4, 5, and 6, E3, 4, 5, and 6, and F 3, 4, 5, and 6. The center is important because usually having control of the center means having control of the game. I'll discuss the center more in detail in a future video, but if you have time, check out a video on center control by Penguin Chess. I'll link that in the description below. You can control squares in the center by 1, placing a piece on that square, i.e. E4 or E5, or using a flank pawn or a pawn next to the center, or essentially a pawn on the C file or the F file to attack moving to a center square, such as if white decided to respond with F4. Their goal here is to get black to take this pawn, and after, say, playing a move like knight F3 to prevent the queen from coming to check here, on white's next move, they can move this pawn here up to D4, and then they would have control of the center because they would have a pawn on both these squares, which would control that square and control that square. Or, say, after white plays E4, what if black plays C5? This is the start of Sicilian defense, and the goal here is the same. They're using a flank pawn to attack a square that is in the center. Having this pawn here will deter white from moving their pawn here, because then white would lose a center pawn for a flank pawn. And then black later in the game would still have their center pawns and use that to control the center of the board. Most openings you choose play into center control initially, which is great for you. So all you need to do is just choose the right opening. I'll put out a follow-up video on openings based on a chess.com article following this video. Objective 2, obtain active squares for your minor pieces. A minor piece is a knight or a bishop. Both these pieces are worth 3 points. A major piece is your rook or your queen. The rook is worth 5 points, the queen is worth 9 points. In the beginning, you want to use your minor pieces to get to active squares. In the opening, an active square will be one where a minor piece attacks one of these center squares to gain control of it. For instance, in this case, we have the Sicilian defense. White played E4, black decided to respond with C5. A good developing move would be to play knight to C3. What knight to C3 is doing is it's putting your knight on an active square and attacking the square right here. So black has a piece attacking the square. White would love to move the pawn to D4. And now that they've developed this knight, they have an extra protector of the square. So now white could either choose to move this pawn up to C3, adding another defender here for the square, or simply just move to D4 and attack this pawn. Let's dive a little bit further into putting minor pieces on active squares. Let's take this opening. White plays E4, black will respond with E5, and then the knight, white will move its knight to F3. Now this knight moving here is doing 2 things. One, it's attacking this pawn right here, but 2, it's adding a protector of this square right here that this pawn happens to be attacking. See, with having these center pawns, they naturally attack the square diagonal to them because pawns attack diagonal. So they attack and control the square at the same time. So that's what these 2 pawns in the center of the board are doing. What white is doing here is they're attacking this pawn because they want to get this pawn away from the center. That way they can take control of the center. But black has a way to respond to that by simply moving their knight to c6. Now, what black is doing is they're protecting this pawn on e5 and adding another defender to this square here on d4. From this position, there are 2 popular openings that players tend to respond to. One will be the Italian opening, which is moving this bishop here on f1 to c4. Basically what this bishop is doing is that it's attacking this weak f7 pawn, which we'll get into why this is a big weakness in another video. And it's also clearing this space right here so the king, or so white can castle next move. Black can usually play black can usually play how they would want to play. I would respond probably by putting my knight here on f6 to attack this pawn. White will probably bring their knight to c3 to protect that pawn, and the game will continue. Another opening that players like to use is called the Ruy Lopez. And that is simply, instead of moving the bishop to c4, you put it on b5. You're directly attacking the knight, which is a defender of this pawn right here. And if black were to move this pawn here on d7 up to protect here or here, now this knight is pinned to the king, which means the knight cannot move without putting the king in check. It is important to get minor pieces to active squares, not only because they are useful, but also it helps with our next objective. Objective 3, achieve king safety. The best way to achieve king safety and start to develop your major pieces is by castling. Moving minor pieces like the bishop on f1 and the knight on g1 make castling on the king side easy. Castling queen side requires moving an extra piece in the queen, but that can work to your advantage. Castling does 2 things. A, it pushes the king further into the corner away from the action. And B, it allows the rook in the corner to get into the action by being in a better position to attack on open files and or protect the back rank where the king is. So an example of castling king side is, first you want to get this setup right here. You want to get your bishop out and your knight out. Then, so the king will move 2 spaces here toward the rook, and the rook will move on the opposite side of the king. And that is a castle. Now, if you wanted to castle queenside, you would need that same empty space in between the king and the rook. The king would still move 2 spaces just to the opposite side, and then the rook will move on the outside of the king. Objective 4. Lastly, develop your queen. A lot of beginners hear that the queen is the most powerful piece in chess and try to take advantage of that by moving out their queen to intimidate other players. Don't fall for it. Instead, make them pay tenfold for insulting your chess intelligence. The problem with developing your queen too early is that it becomes vulnerable to attacks by minor pieces or pawns, and it can slow down development of your other pieces. Let's say white played e4, black played e5, and white decided, well, you know what? I'm going to bring my queen out here to h5. Black, if they are still in the beginning phases, they might see that their opponent brought out their queen early. That might intimidate them. They might get a little scared and play anxiously instead of playing more solid moves. In this case, let's say black plays pawn at g6, thinking, okay, well, I'm going to directly attack the queen. White is hoping you would play that because now they can do something like this. They can take this pawn on e5, they're putting you in check, and they're attacking this rook right here. What do? Well, you do what you can to get out of check. So you put your queen there. Now the white's queen will take your rook. And now their plan is to slowly gobble up all these pieces over here on your king side. And now black has to work to recover. However, this does not need to happen. Let's go back here. Now, black can completely ignore the fact that white brought their queen out too early. They can simply, instead of playing a move like g6 to attack the queen directly, they can simply develop their minor pieces, a minor piece, and putting the knight on c6. And what the knight on c6 does is that the knight on c6 protects this pawn. That way, on your next move, if you want to move that up, now you don't have that same threat there, because now the queen is not going to attack this pawn because its knight is protecting it. Now white would probably, I don't know, probably bring this bishop out here. What you can do is now you can play pawn to g6, because now the queen has to move. Queen can't just go back here because this queen is on this file. Queen can't move up there because then this knight and this bishop attack the square. So now the queen will probably have to retreat somewhere there. Simply develop this pawn here. Now this bishop is attacking this queen and this pawn is attacking this bishop. And now the queen will be forced to retreat here because black is going to pick up that pawn, and then the queen can just attack back. White wasted time bringing their queen out early, only to pay for it later. Black was able to develop their pieces, some of their other pieces, attack the queen, and the queen wasted time developing only one piece, while black was able to put their knight on the board, bring this pawn out to attack the bishop, take the bishop, and by moving that pawn out, they opened up a lane for the bishop to attack through. Now this bishop can develop out here. This pawn was already here, so now this bishop can come out whenever it's ready. And now black is just in a better setup and position than white is, all because white decided to bring the queen out too early. The more you play chess and understand tempo, the less you will want to waste moves on weak threats, such as bringing your queen out to h5 like white just did. You want to play forcing moves where you are always in control. There are many advantages to the queen, one being the fact that the queen could jump across the board very quickly. It can cover a lot of ground and attack a lot of pieces at once. But you only start the game with one queen. And unless you know how to utilize your pawns to get to the other side of the board and promote to another queen, you're only going to have one queen in the game. So you want to use her wisely and develop the queen after you have moved your minor pieces to active squares and your king is safe. Objective 5. Secure the back rank by connecting the rooks. The fifth objective is sometimes not the easiest, but it is well worth it. It will require developing all of your minor pieces so that the only thing in the back rank are your two rooks and your king. Connecting the rooks makes it that much harder to attack the back rank. The king will, for the most part of the game, spend its time in the back rank, so you want to make sure it has adequate protection. The king usually doesn't move out further in the board until the endgame phase, where a lot of the pieces that could attack the king are off the board. It's mostly pawns, maybe a minor piece here and there. The queens and rooks are usually gone, or in a position where the king can move a little bit freer than it would initially. A great spot for your rooks are on open files. It stops pieces from sitting on the files, and it can also cut off the rest of the board to your enemy's king, depending on where the king is sitting. On the flip side, it puts your rook in position to attack the enemy king if the moment presents itself. Open files are where the rooks are the strongest because it allows them to move freely. Since rooks move vertically and horizontally, it makes sense that open rook or open files will be the best place for your rook. So those are the goals of the opening that you as a beginner should be focusing on. Now, once you get more advanced and learn more tactics and strategies and see other openings, then you will play openings that don't have each and every one of those goals or objectives in mind. Some of those objectives will come later in the game, and some of them you won't need to do at all. It is possible to win a game by your king staying exactly where it is, not castling at all. I hope this gave you more clarity on what to focus on as a beginner. The opening can definitely be a mystery. Now, I know your next question is probably, okay, now that I know what to do in opening, what opening do I use? That is a loaded and broad question, which is why I decided to make another video to follow this one to answer that question. Click on the video here to the right to watch it. Otherwise, thank you for tuning into this video, and I will see you in the next one.